First, good morning, and thank you all for joining us this morning. It has been quite a busy week for many of us, and I do appreciate the time that you're taking to join us this morning. I'm going to open with just a couple of notes, and then we will go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining the Mitchell Center for African American Heritage this morning. So my name is Stephanie Lampkin, and I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping items. So we ask that you mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Many of you should be muted, but for whatever reason, if you are able to use your microphone, it will just help us with some background noise. So again, we do ask that you mute your microphone if you are not speaking. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so please put your questions in the Q&A for the speaker, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. Also, this talk is being recorded. So the Mitchell Center is dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing for the public Delaware's African American history. And while our physical building is currently closed, I certainly invite you to view a video of our exhibition, Journey to Freedom. And I'm sharing that with you in the chat. So you should be able to access that link where we do have a short orientation video. It's about 13 minutes of our exhibition. And if you enjoy this event, please check out our calendar for upcoming events being offered through the Delaware Historical Society, including the Mitchell Center's open mic event on July 3rd, and an event on July 9th, which is called History Happens Now, where DHS's chief curator will discuss the COVID Chronicles Delaware project, which is our effort to collect Delawareans' responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you are not familiar with this project that we launched about 2 months ago, again, I am putting a link in the chat so that you can access that and explore the project. You can also submit your own story if you have not already, and check out the blog where we've published some of the stories across the state that represent how people have been experiencing this time. So without further ado, I want to welcome, I am extremely excited about Ms. Coleman's presence this morning. I've been following her work now for a couple of years, and I have admired a lot of the work that she has done. Christy Coleman grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia, and earned her bachelor's and master's degree from Hampton University. She currently serves as executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation in Williamsburg, Virginia. She is a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, and inclusion. And she's an innovator and leader in the history museum field. Ms. Coleman strives to make museum experiences and shared history meaningful to diverse communities. And she's written numerous articles, is an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and has appeared on several national programs. So if Ms. Coleman looks familiar, you may have been touched by her work. And I want to thank her again for joining us on a day like today, where we will hear a bit about the history of Juneteenth, which is important today as we kind of lead into the holiday on the 19th. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Ms. Coleman.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me today. Because I am sensitive to Stephanie's desire to keep this to an hour, including time for you to ask questions about this presentation, I'm just going to jump right in to today's presentation to be free a citizen, and a voter. And before we advance to the next slide, what I want to give you just a little background, a little space for all of us to really think about the meaning of these words, particularly as it relates to the African American community and other indigenous and people of color. So here's the thing. Even from the earliest colonial developments, even after 1619, when the first Africans are brought here and enslaved in Virginia, and this practice spreads into the other colonies, with Massachusetts actually being the first of the 13 colonies to legalize servitude for life for persons of African descent. Even in the midst of that, there's always been free Black people, those who either came in before those legal changes, those who had been manumitted or set free through personal will or actions of the enslavers themselves. But the issue of citizenship and whether or not these folks would have a voice in the development, at least in the traditional ways, has always been a question. And so I'm going to focus also, clearly, since we're talking about Juneteenth coming up on Friday, and all of these issues are currently being addressed with the disparities that exist for African Americans even in 2020 when it comes to these things. I thought, and Stephanie and I thought, that this presentation was probably going to be the one that could resonate the most, give you the historical backing to help you understand a little further. So as we talk about freedom, obviously we talk about the American Civil War. And the American Civil War, I will tell you, is probably the most lied about, misrepresented period in American history for a variety of reasons. But the biggest reason is post-war, especially into the early 20th century, the lost cause narrative, and that is the narrative that was established by the former Confederates and their allies, took over the way that we remember this in American history, which is why we have Confederate statues not just in southern states, but why you see them in places that weren't even states during the conflict. So we're going to take a quick run through that. Next slide, please. All right, so we start with the election of 1860. I'm gonna make this real quick. The 1860 election had 4 different parties that were running for the presidency. This is the year that Abraham Lincoln will win. And you can see there is a solid block in the South of Southern Democrats that were had as their candidate Breckinridge, Lincoln as the Republican, which was a new political party. And I have to be really clear, the parties in 1860 are not the same parties that we experience today. There were major shifts in platforms and ideology of these parties that took place due to something called the Southern Strategy that began to play out in the 1960s. But in the election of 1860, again, you have Bell, who's a constitutional unionist, and you have the Northern Democrat in Douglas. And you can see Douglas is the one who received the least of the votes and the swing for this. So Lincoln wins this election by a fairly large margin, considering you've got 4 different parties and candidates running for the presidency. What's more important is his winning, and because the platform of the Republican Party was to hold slavery where she stood, and understanding that within that party there were those who were deemed radical, who not only wanted to end slavery, but who also wanted to see, not only wanted to end slavery, but also wanted to extend citizenship rights to African Americans. They were considered the truly radical element of the Republican Party. So Lincoln getting elected by such a wide margin, both in terms of popular vote as well as by electoral votes, the South saw this as an immediate threat to their, quote, way of life, which was the protection of slavery. Next slide. And as you look at a map of the United States at the time, those darker areas are the mass percentages of where African Americans are. whether free or enslaved. And as you can see, those areas that are really, really dark on this slide, like along the Mississippi River, along that South Carolina, Georgia coast, those areas have enslaved populations over 60%. So there were a whole new series of laws and things that are taking place that are really going to impact the nation. And as you see at the bottom of this page, the US population was over 31 million people, with 3.9 million of them enslaved African Americans. Next slide, please. One of the things that cracks me up is when I hear people say, well, you know, the Civil War, the South didn't go to war to preserve slavery, which is absolutely not true. They were very clear in their orders of secession why they were leaving. States' rights was something actually that had been advocated by northern states during the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, where the northern states were saying, look, we are not going to use our resources. We are not going to defy our state laws that say Black people here are free to help you round up who you think might be a runaway slave. So that state assertion of state rights first came from northern areas, and it would be later usurped by the South on this issue. But if you look at this order of secession, looking at South Carolina, 57% of its population are enslaved people. Mississippi, which would be the second state to secede from the United States, 55%, and so on down the list. As you can see, it is a major factor, and there's deep concern among these white Southerners that emancipation not only would destroy their economy, it had the potential to destroy, quote, had the potential to destroy white supremacy on which a whole lot of our nation was built. Next slide. Question I always get when I say, well, you know, the majority of white people did not own slaves. That's true, but the majority of white people at the time were very much wedded to and in support of white supremacy. So just as today, where the bulk of the wealth in the nation is held by a pretty small percentage, nonetheless, there seems to be this sense that protecting that ideal is somehow something to try to achieve if you are a white person in 1860. I may not own slaves, but I have a social order that puts me above them. And number two, if I'm successful, if I work hard, then I can own slaves too. So the mentality of it is significant impact on everyone in the South. Is that to say that there were not Southerners who were Unionists? Absolutely. The Confederacy was not a solid block of support the way you would think it was at the time. There were Southern Unionists. There were some states that were absolutely split. You have states like Missouri that had representation in the Confederate government as well as representation in the US government. You have places like, ironically, like Mississippi, where there were Mississippians led by a man by the name of Newton Knight, who actually took over the whole of his county from Confederate strongholds and protected it throughout the war as a Unionist stronghold, and so forth. So, and in the North, everybody wasn't about emancipation when this war started. It started for the United States as a war to preserve the Union. It would become a war for freedom because of the actions of African Americans and their allies. Next slide. So again, just to be clear, the United States went to war initially to preserve the Union. The Confederacy from the start went to war to preserve slavery. What you're seeing here is the political intent that is played out in the social order from the Confederate States of America Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 makes plain, no bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of persons' ownership in Negro slaves shall be passed. Bottom line is, you cannot under any circumstance free an enslaved person. Article 4, Section 2 also prohibits states from interfering with, and my screen is blocked, so I need to move that just like, from interfering with slavery. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in several other states, and shall have the right to transit and sojourn in any state of this confederacy with their slaves and other property. The right of property and said slaves shall not be therefore impaired. And then finally, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 3, offered to slavery in all future territories conquered or acquired by the Confederacy. So unlike the United States, where laws have been passed in the Compromise of 1850 and others that said that new territories that were seeking to attain statehood, that they could vote for themselves and decide whether or not they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. In the Confederacy, they made plain any areas that they conquered or acquired were slave states, period. And just so that you're clear, the Confederacy did have expansionist plans that were in play during the Civil War. They actually wanted to invade Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, but the Confederates saw Mexico and Central America as prime options there and were trying to align with former slaveholders and those wealthy families in Mexico who wanted to reinstitute slavery there. They also were had set up embassies in Australia as well as in China. And in China, their goal was to, in the event that Europe and the United States continued their assault on the ban or importation of Africans, that they would get other slaves or try to enslave people coming in out of China. So it's really, the intent of the Confederacy was very clear and actually stated in their cornerstone speech that this society of the Confederacy was established with the understanding that the white race is the superior race and the proper place for the Negro was one of servitude and enslavement. So they were real clear about why they were going to war. But again, they would change their tune when the world eventually turns against them in the 1880s and 1890s in particular. But that is a high period, 1890 through actually the 1950s, when this lost cause, this idea that no, it was just states' rights and it was about tariffs and it was never about slavery and, you know, we loved our Black people or whatever other nonsense there was, took hold. Next slide. Now, how did racial construct impact a global world? Now, this is one that I'm just going to spend, again, a little bit of time on, but it's important. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, there is considerable trade, even in the medieval world, between sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. So this idea that and then it feeds into this false idea that somehow the transatlantic slave trade was somehow not unlike any other forms of slavery that have existed in the history of the world. That simply is not true. This is the largest forced migration in the history of the world. In the history of the world, tens of millions of African peoples from throughout the central and middle portions of the continent would be transported around the world for the sole purpose of being enslaved. It is not like Greek or Roman systems. It is not like even intra-tribal systems where a person may be a slave or the property of another. It was never hereditary. They were never deemed chattel. And actually there were always ways for people to become freemen in their own right. This is not the case with the transatlantic slave trade. And what ends up happening in the late 17th century and into the 18th century to justify this cruelty, to justify this crime against humanity, they begin to, first and foremost, begin to denigrate the societies that have existed throughout Africa. This is not just hunter-gatherer societies. There are major cities that existed throughout the continent, throughout sub-Saharan Africa and Central West African. We have had these images from as early as the 12th and 13th centuries of these cities and these political orders. And the Western world, the European world, for the most part, simply chose to ignore them or to suppress them, so that it would not happen. So by the time we fast forward to the American Civil War, there has already been a conscious shift in a lot of nations where slavery is on the way out, as it were, but not because of economic reasons. It's on the way out because at the time, people did find it a moral affront that this was being done to other fellow human beings. The states that would make up the Confederate States of America, just to tell you, give you a sense of sort of the wealth and power there, 90% of the world's cotton was produced by the American South in 1860. The American South, those 11 states that made up the Southern Confederacy, had the 6th largest economy in the world at the time. So they had the arrogance to think that the world would support them because they were providing the world with their cotton and that the world would provide support. That, again, did not end up happening because initially a lot of the Western world just thought this was an example of why democratic republicanism could not work, that it was necessary to have oligarchies and monarchies and aristocracies because a democracy could not work, and look, they're going to go tear each other apart because there's no one to tell them exactly what to do. So they tended to think of it initially as a fight between a civil war, quite frankly, so that they weren't going to get involved, despite a lot of efforts both on Lincoln's part and Jeff Davis's part to try to get European countries to support it. In time, Lincoln would win out, especially when the decision is made to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And I know that there are many of you out there who say, well, that didn't really free people. Yes, it did. We know that it had its shortcomings because it did not apply to the border states. It did free people in Washington, D.C. It, more importantly, though, allowed for the formation of the United States Colored Troops. We'll get to them in a little bit. Next slide, please. So again, the images that you're seeing, this is coming out of the Caribbean as we talk about punishment and how often Europeans would use other enslaved people to support their agenda. And so this is an example of that. This is, again, an image out of the Dutch Antilles, but it is a common scene throughout the colonies and the places where African slavery or the enslavement of Africans and their descendants was common. And you can see in this image in addition to the whipping that's taking place, you can see the collar that's there on the ground as people essentially are being lined up towards their own punishment, and new enslaved people are being brought into this plantation setting. Next slide. This is another one, and I wanted to share this one with you because in order to maintain this system, it is very much a brutal system. It is one where violence, physical violence, the threat of violence, as well as the threat of having one's child or family members separated from you, were means of coercion, means of control. But even in that, people found ways to rebel. Next slide. One of the ways in this quest for freedom starts, again, early. This is actually a runaway ad from 1736 in Virginia. And you can see, and again, there are runaway ads that date all the way back to the 1640s. Run away from my house in Richmond County sometime in August last, a tawny young Negro fellow named Will, very likely and sensible for a slave, which, again, this idea that somehow Black folks are not bright. He lived for many years at Ripon Hall near Williamsburg and was removed on account of his ill behavior. Again, resistance of one form or another, so he was separated. He was sold from his family. It is supposed he went to Ripon and carried off with him a young Negro wench named Sarah, his sister, and that they have gone to the eastern shore with a fellow named Peter, belonging to one Lee on York River, and has been indulged by his master to work abroad. What's interesting here is when he says has been indulged by his master to work abroad, this is a case of an enslaved person who's been given some autonomy, to find work for themselves or to actually travel. So this is highly likely that Will and Sarah will not be found because Peter does have access and a means to go about. So again, there's a bounty on them, and this is again just an example of the resistance to the institution that is consistent from day one. Next slide. These are more runaway ads over different periods of time. Next slide. Now, I mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation that that went into effect January 1st, 1863. Many of you who may have watch night services in your churches on New Year's Eve, this practice actually began in 1862 because enslaved communities gathered in their houses of worship or in their worship groups, waiting to see if the Confederacy would respond to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Because here's the thing. It was issued in September of 1862 to give the Confederacy 100 days to get their act together and come back to the Union and to discuss terms. When they did not, again, it brought into effect the freedom of some, not all. It also created the United States Colored Troops, and it also established in firm order the Second Confiscation Act, which essentially said any enslaved person who ran to the Union Army for protection would in fact be protected and would gain their freedom. But Lincoln understood very well that his executive order, for lack of a better term, once the war was over, may not and probably wouldn't have as much teeth. He knew once this was done that he had to get to work on a constitutional amendment. Next slide. This is an image of a sailor, United States sailor in the 1860s during the Civil War. 200,000 men with the Emancipation Proclamation and the creation of the United States Colored Troops. Over 200,000 Black men, most of whom were formerly enslaved, will serve as soldiers or sailors during the war, providing a much needed source of not only soldiering, and the fact that they were actually soldiers as such was just a complete affront to the Confederacy, who was using enslaved labor to support its army. The idea on the South, because there were, and if you've ever heard somebody say, well, there were Black Confederate soldiers, that is not true. There were several laws that were passed to make that not true. There was under no circumstances that the Confederacy want Black men to serve as soldiers. There were three big reasons for that. The first reason was war was always seen as a way to prove one's manhood. And if one has served admirably in the course of war, it means that they have more than demonstrated their ability and their having earned full citizenship rights and property rights. It was a way to, number three, rise above your station. The Confederacy, again, numerous times made clear legally and otherwise that they would not have Black men as soldiers. Instead, they used them as labor. So it was Black soldiers that were hauling equipment. It was it was enslaved people in the Confederacy who were hauling equipment, who were building trench works, who were doing all of this work. And it's so prevalent that many of you may not know about this, but even in July of 1863 with the Battle of Gettysburg, because Lee knew that he was going into Pennsylvania and Northern Territory, he had all of the Black impressed slaves. This meant impressed slaves, meaning those, as a requirement of the Confederacy, if you owned slaves, you had to send them to the army to do this work for a minimum of 6 months. He wanted all of those people to be to the rear of the line and to stay in Virginia, because he knew that many of them, because he'd already experienced this, would run off in the chaos of war seeking freedom. So this was a major, major problem. In addition, as the Confederate Army was moving through Pennsylvania, they were also kidnapping free Black people, sending them to the back of the line and having them sold. So these are some of the stories that you don't hear, but very much a part of the reality of the American Civil War. Next slide. Now, when freedom did come at the close of the war, there is a whole different thing that starts to take place. And one of the first things that happens is we enter a period called Reconstruction. And if you read anything about Reconstruction in school, you probably read that it was a failure. I am here to tell you Reconstruction was not a failure. Reconstruction was abandoned. And there are several reasons for that. Next slide. Number one, and we've already talked about Emancipation Proclamation, I'm sorry. But one of the things about this, by the way, that we continue to do, particularly in Black churches, is we continue to have watch night. But I just want to remind you that watch night, these watch meetings and their evolution of Jubilee, waiting for freedom, continue in many Black communities today. So this is another carryover of the period. Next slide. I mentioned also with the Emancipation Proclamation earlier, Lincoln understood that he had to, he very much had to make a change to the Constitution. And that's where we get the 13th Amendment, which is very clear, actually one of the cleanest constitutional amendments that we have in this nation. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, and this becomes important. Whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. What ends up happening is, in the South anyway, they start inventing crime for Black people as a way to take away their rights and to force them into slavery by any other name. And this has continued through our legal system ever since. This prison pipeline that on minor crime, but it started as a way back in the pretty much after the start of this Freedom Amendment, the 13th Amendment. So even children as young as 10, 11, 12 could be charged with a crime of, you know, taking a piece of bread from an orchard and then be charged with a life sentence for stealing an apple off a tree. Kid you not. Now, this is how the South got around it. And Congress initially passed a number of laws in Reconstruction to try to prevent this and to back it up when they realized what was happening, and then sent in federal troops into the 5 military districts that were created for this to try to protect the new freedmen. But again, once America, by the time we got into the late 1870s and 1880s, the cost of continuing this was too great, and they started abandoning it. And with that abandonment came a whole slew of other issues. But before we get there, next slide. Emancipation and the actual legal with the 13th Amendment had a tremendous effect right off the bat. The first Black vote, we believe, takes place actually in 1866. In Virginia, before it is actually having a constitutional amendment for that. But African Americans right away seized the moment of their freedom by establishing schools right off the bat. They started educating themselves. We have a roster in Richmond, Virginia, of a freedmen's school where the youngest student was 3 years old and the oldest student was 80. People were again, education was the piece that they wanted very much to participate in, and finding work and lands for themselves, pooling their resources, starting small communities, you name it, they were doing it with great success. Next slide. This is an example of one of the schools and how they worked. And as you can see, again, there are adults as well as children in this school. Free Black women from northern states came down. There were many what they called beneficial societies that were established even during the course of the war that were setting up plans of what freedom was going to look like and what support they could provide to the newly freed. So as soon as emancipation is announced as a constitutional issue, these teachers move into place all throughout the South. building schools, teaching people reading, writing, mathematics, all kinds of extraordinary curricula were being developed for them. Next slide. Families were being reunited. This is an image of a United States colored troop soldier with his family. This is an image you may have seen, but you can see his children there with him and his wife. There's a previous image of him alone, but this is post-war that the families are in fact reunited, and those families that had been separated in slavery. Newspaper articles and ads are being placed throughout newspapers all over the South of people looking for their loved ones and asking, providing the information that they knew of what happened and where that person was from to try to reconnect. And we see a mass movement of African American people trying to consolidate their family groupings again. Next slide. The 14th Amendment was much more complex. It's ratified in 1868. But the 14th Amendment is critical for a number of reasons. Number one, it establishes citizenship. It says that any person born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction are citizens of the nation and the state where they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state, and this is the other part, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection under the law. This was in direct response to some of the things that Southerners were doing, especially with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866 and its rapid spreading. The 14th Amendment was designed to address all of this. And it is another one of our constitutional amendments that is continually under attack, and one that we know that is often unequally applied. Next slide. So by the time we get to 1868, we are in a political year. It was an election year, and yes, Black folks were having these people who were formerly enslaved just 3 years before, who were getting educated, also had political informational meetings. There was actually, as this slide shows, electioneering in the South, 1868. These were usually free Blacks, not always, but there were these coalitions that would get together and talk about issues, talk about candidates. And they did this throughout the South because they wanted Black men to be informed when they went to the polls. And in 1868, overwhelmingly, Ulysses S. Grant is elected president of the United States. He was someone with whom they had trusted. He is someone who had advocated and fought directly against the rise of the Klan and would actually establish congressional hearings or have congressional hearings established to strike them down wherever they landed. And so all of this is a part of the extra movement that takes place with the 14th Amendment. Again, granting citizenship rights. Next slide. The 15th Amendment comes along, again, pretty simple, ratified in 1870. The right of citizens to the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state based on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The 15th Amendment is the one that we find constantly under attack and other ways. And part of the reason for this is that, particularly in the last 40 years, since the civil rights, since the rollback of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, we saw the rollback of those just 4 years ago, that the power of defining how elections are held are being left to the states. And as such, many states, especially unscrupulous states that were a part of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act that had oversight over them because of their consistent ways that they were trying to disenfranchise and had disenfranchised African Americans, were lifted. When that happened, we began to see such tactics as closing down polling locations in predominantly Black communities. We see things like literally having to stand in line for 10 hours to vote that we saw recently here in Georgia during the primaries. And it is because of the usurp of not only the intent of the 15th Amendment, but again, because Congress in its actions passed a lot of the rules and regulations about voting to states themselves. Next slide. But vote we did. Just as an example, here in Virginia, with the passage of the 15th Amendment and that election of 1868, and then the midterm election of 1870, here in Virginia, in the election of 1870, there are 140,000 Black men who are voting for the first time, 140,000. When these laws begin to be, again, this usurpation of the 15th Amendment happens and states start putting in other kinds of restrictions in Virginia, as an example, by the 1904 election, because they have stripped voting rights from people. By the way, it's also the same year that Virginia, I'm picking on my own state, it's also the same year that Virginia established laws that said you can't take down a Confederate monument. Okay, the same year that they do that, they strip the voting rights of virtually all African-American men to the point where only 10,000 were eligible to vote in 1904, and half of white people, white males, would lose their right to vote in Virginia because either they were deemed in areas that were in support of a more progressive agenda, and so they blocked them from voting. You know, created poll taxes and literacy tests and all kinds of things to control that. Next slide. Here's another example of, this is right before the midterm elections in 1870. This is the National Colored Convention session in Washington, D.C. Again, this idea that the Black political movement is happening rapidly. They are continuing to do it, and they are fighting against these. But there is something else that is happening, and that is the way that Southerners are trying to depict African Americans in legislatures, because those early folks that are being voted in are, in fact, more often than not, had been previously free people who were highly educated. But it was the affront of having Black men making laws for white men that were deemed unacceptable, even in places in the North. Next slide. Just to give you an example of this affront, this is the grand jury that was selected for the treason trial for Jefferson Davis, who had been held at Fort Monroe for 2 years for his role as president of the Confederacy. And this was the grand jury that was reviewing this. There was so much outrage that there were these many Black men that were going to judge over him. It didn't happen. Essentially, President Johnson shuts it all down and gives a pass to the former Confederates. And it is stunning what happens. Actually, it's stunning. Read about Andrew Johnson and his presidency. Next slide. But again, the resistance was always there. Next slide. And the resistance became more intense when Reconstruction is abandoned. We have out and out voter intimidation. So when folks actually were showing up, they'd either raid their homes. There was a horrible event where Klansmen and white supremacists went into Black communities and shot them up, killed people randomly. We're waiting for people who, like this image shows, literally putting guns to people's heads if they dare to vote, and would shoot them on the spot, and no one would say they saw a thing when it came time to convict someone or to try to press charges for those crimes. Next slide. Domestic terrorism was given a full onslaught, and the White League and the Ku Klux Klan were the two largest entities, but these organizations would continue to have power not only in the South, but would gain considerable prominence in the early 20th century, even in the North. There was a massive rally of the Ku Klux Klan, just to give you an example, in New York City, a huge march with tens of thousands of Klansmen in New York City, marching down its streets, proclaiming white supremacy and threatening non-white people. Next slide. So when Reconstruction is abandoned, Black schools, Black churches, Black communities are burned to the ground. Some groups go so far, like what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, that had a duly elected Black mayor, several members on the council, several members who were serving in Congress, literally overthrew their government. The duly elected government, burned out in Wilmington, North Carolina. Again, just as an example, and those people never face justice for what they did in removing and killing those council people and burning those places. Next slide. And then again, the taking back of political bodies. With the abandonment of Reconstruction, many former Confederates were given back their right to vote and to serve in legislatures throughout the South and even into the US Congress. And the result of that would be a rollback, like in this moment of hope of the expansion of what America could be. We see this enormous backlash that takes place, and we will live under that backlash minimally for another 100 years. And some could easily argue we are living with its vestiges even today. Next slide. I've told you already about the lost cause and its impact on the public landscape. Next slide. But just so that you can see sort of the range of them, these are various Confederate monuments. The one at the top is the Jefferson Davis Monument. That actually, the Davis statue was toppled here in Richmond. The one in the lower left is, those two on the lower left are Robert E. Lee's in different communities, North and South. And then you have the Southern Confederacy Monument. This was at a national battlefield park. Next slide. But just to give you an idea that these aren't harmless pieces. This is an example of some of the language that is on it. In commemoration of the 39th annual reunion of the United Confederate Veterans at Charlotte, North Carolina, June 4 through 7th, 1929, a state and a city's tribute of love in grateful recognition of the services of the Confederate soldiers whose heroism in war and fidelity in peace have never been surpassed. Accepting the abatement of war, they preserved the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South and became master builders of a reunited country. Veritas vincit. Basically, we are vindicated in truth, is what that says. These are not harmless. They never were. Next slide. Here's another one. United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers. But the national election of November of 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. Again, this is the language on a lot of these monuments throughout the South. Next slide. And then we have this one that I know is currently in the news. This is actually one of the first monuments that is actually put up in 1866. It's called Emancipation. And it is supposed to reflect Lincoln telling a man by the name of, telling a man that he had to kneel to no one and to rise up because he was a freeman. Unfortunately, what we see is a Black man on his knees with Lincoln beside him. And so rather than the rest of the story onto which this was supposed to be based. But what it does, one of the other things that visually it does, is it takes away agency of Black people in their own liberation. And that's something we have to be very careful about. Next slide. All right. That actually, I think there was one after. That's the closer. So anyway, that's where we land in understanding 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments and their role and emancipation and all of that. There is so much more that I could talk to you about, but I see we have questions in queue. Lynn Howard, at one point you lost audio. I hope that you got it back. And thank you so much for the that you're enjoying the presentation. Your question is, to what extent do we think that the full story in schools in this country? My assumption is that educators just skim the surface. Your thoughts about that are absolutely right. They do skim the surface. That in many cases students will encounter the American Civil War is when it is and more often than not, there are very real challenges about how we teach this. A national movement afoot to correct these narratives, and not just in our museum spaces, but also in our education spaces, and working with teachers to bring them the information and scholarship that they need to support them in the classroom. I see in the chat box there are some other things in here. David Young to all the panel. Might be good to see Delaware stats here. There were 1,798 enslaved Africans in Delaware in 1860. 19,829 free blacks out of a total of 112,000 plus. Thank you for that, David Young. Taking questions. All right. Here's another question. Considering the current activism and civil unrest, how can we expand correct interpretations of Confederate monuments to provide a more informed, complex, and understanding of our shared history? Again, this is where I think it's important for our museum community as a start. There are 35,000 museums throughout the United States, and no, they're not all history institutions, but they are in some way either related to history, related to art, or some other thing that we can begin to tackle the public landscape as a whole. In my prior role as president and CEO of the American Civil War Museum, we did this. We put up a mini website on the history of each and every one of the Confederate monuments, particularly on Monument Avenue, as well as other parts of the city where they exist and throughout the state, and laid out you know, not necessarily about blogs or anything, but truly just making available from our archives the documents that showed exactly what these monuments were built for. And I can imagine that you have the same things in your community. Are there any other questions? I believe we have 7 minutes remaining. Any parallels? This is for a question from Linda O'Neill. Any parallels to today or lessons learned from the past to provide guidance for today? There's always that. I tell people all the time, history has never been for the dead. The questions that we ask of our historical past are based in the realities that we are currently living. So if we want to look at voter suppression and how it's taking place in our nation today, we need to understand how it was done, because honestly, the playbook is exactly the same, and you need to be on guard against that. When you're talking about unequal treatment of law enforcement on communities of color, it has always been the case. And when we talk about the violence against Black communities, those stories, you know, people in Oklahoma knew nothing about what happened in Tulsa and the destroying of Black Wall Street there and that community. People who grow up in Florida have no idea about what happened in Rosewood. People who grew up in Tennessee have no idea of what happened at not only at Fort Pillow, but also in terms of what happened in a community that literally was razed 3 times by these white supremacist forces. So they're there. Again, this idea of equal protection of the law has not existed for Black communities, and certainly for other communities of color. It is inconsistent, but you have to understand what our Constitution says, and you have to understand what your role is as a free person, as a citizen, and as a voter to make those changes. Next question is coming from Holly Golder. To add to this, how we merge the complex nature of individuals who have performed great achievements that also enslave people. I think you have to deal with what you consider great achievements. One of the most interesting things I saw recently was someone said, hey, if somebody kidnapped and sold your child, potentially even raped and beat them, where would you like that monument to go? Right? So we recognize that there are people with complex past, and we can, and it's sort of a cop-out to say, well, they lived in a different era that, you know, believed differently. That's not true. There were people against this institution, even in every single era that we're talking about. It was just convenient. It is the way that a nation built its wealth, was off the back of slavery. So it is a complex question, though. Because people have asked me, well, you say that about Confederate monuments, what about a monument like to George Washington or to Thomas Jefferson? And to that I say, we know what type of slaveholder both of those men were. We also know that both of those men contributed something a little bit bigger beyond themselves, even in their shortcomings. Still gave us language of all men are created equal in Jefferson's case, even if he didn't believe it. He gave us the language of hope. When you're talking about Confederate monuments, they're not giving us language of hope. They're giving us language of separation and subjugation of other human beings. And so, and again, even if those founding documents and people are not, I think we have to go to the ideas behind these things and the values of the community. And frankly, if a community's values shift and say, well, we don't want statues of Washington either, or we don't want statues of Columbus either, then that's, I think, ultimately up to the community. Because here's the thing, statues are not history. They are expressions of a community's value at a particular time. America has taken up and taken down and put up statues throughout her history. This is not new. It's just that we've sort of put this, this holy veil around this stuff, but it's not new. I mean, we don't have statues of King George III. All of them were ripped out. We don't have a lot of statues of Henry Clay anymore. And so people, there is an evolution of what a community values, and their public art and statuary are representative of that. And if a community's values are shifting, or if there were voices who were screaming out even when these things were put up but were ignored, I think we have an opportunity to do more there. I have a question here from Meg Kane Smith. Are there positive Civil War statues reflecting the agency of Black people? Also, do you think most people realize what Juneteenth is about? We are beginning to see statuary of African Americans. In fact, in Boston, you have the incredible monument that was done of the Massachusetts 54th with their commanding officer, Robert Gould Shaw. So there is one in Boston. Others are being considered in other places. And do I think most people realize what Juneteenth is about? Most white people, no. I think they're just hearing about Juneteenth and are beginning to take a look at what it's about. And excuse me. And I would say, in terms of a holiday or a commemoration that African Americans in general, I would say maybe half actually participate in that, but that would be the same for 4th of July or any other holiday. It just depends on the ability to address it, but they certainly know about it. Sherry Watkins, how might we support teachers in integrating info about African Americans into our K through 16 curriculum? I think the 13 through 16, the college curriculum, because those courseworks are requirements of the university, I think it becomes helpful if universities make one form or another requirements so that people can learn outside of their comfort. In terms of K through 12, again, that's where museum partners and actually advocating with your state social studies folks, because really there is a process about every 5 to 10 years in every state where they are reevaluating the standards of learning, what is required to know. So as a citizen, I would say you contact those folks and say, I want to know when the next cycle is and how you're going to be addressing these questions. That would be my response. That's all the questions that we have in queue. It is now 10:59. See there? Thank you so much to Stephanie Lampkin and her team for inviting me to participate in today's program. I hope that you learned a bit from our conversation today, and I encourage you to keep learning. There are a lot of wonderful things online that you can learn about these, but be careful about those online resources. One of the challenges sometimes is when we go online, we either look for confirmation bias and we're not really paying attention to the strength of the resources that are online. So be very careful about that. I generally tell people if it doesn't have an edu behind it, don't follow it as a starting point. .orgs are good, but we all know people can form their own nonprofit organizations to pretty much say whatever the heck they want. But make sure the sources that you're looking at are collaborative, that there's others who have looked at that research and those numbers as well. Again, thank you all so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Tell your friends. I'll be back giving this presentation this afternoon at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Coleman, and thank you all for joining us. Again, I've left a link for an evaluation for this presentation in the chat, and I've also left a link where you can see our exhibition video on Journey to Freedom about the Mitchell Center and its own exhibition. So thank you again, and please spread the word. If you would like to come back at 6, you are more than welcome, or please share the invitation with your colleagues or friends to invite them for another presentation with Ms. Coleman. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.